Welcome back to Spooky Scary Storytime, the series where we share listeners' allegedly true stories about the creepiest or most unbelievable things that's ever happened to them. The stories that they feel like other people would call them crazy if they shared it with normal people. But we're not normal here. We like everything weird, everything strange, everything spooky. Today's stories all have the common theme of leaving me unsettled. We're open to theories here on what you think was going on. A lot of these people who wrote in sharing these experiences were just curious about the audience's thoughts on what they experienced. So if you have thoughts, if you have questions, let us know in the comments. And if you have a story to submit, you can do that on my website, dogoodstaybad.com. There's a story submissions page. Please just indicate if you'd like to be anonymous. I'm always happy to change names. There's also merch on the website if you want to support the channel. We have mugs, we have cute t-shirts, we have a couple sweaters left. We're just going to get right to the stories. Hope you all enjoy. This spooky scary story time came from someone named Amber, and it's called The Signal People. And Amber says she lives a very normal, boring life. Nothing spooky or exciting really ever happens to her, except for this one experience that happened back in 2017. And she said she still thinks about it. It still gives her the creeps, and she's sending this in to see what everybody else thinks was going on here. But she said she was in her mid-20s at the time, and she was living in a major city and working at a higher-end restaurant, the kind of place that catered to business travelers and people with expense accounts and an otherwise wealthy crowd. When the story takes place, she said that she was going through a really nasty breakup with someone that she had been with for several years, and she was still living with her ex. So at this point in her life, she was just immersing herself in work. She was picking up shifts all the time, and she was trying to be out of her apartment as much as possible. She said for the most part, she enjoyed the job. She was bartending and serving at this restaurant, and she liked her coworkers. She liked the crowd. She always walked with pretty decent money. One Friday night in the summer of 2017, she said she was working behind the bar, and they had just gotten through the dinner rush. It was about 8:30, 9 p.m., and she was starting to do like closing duties because the restaurant closed at 11 p.m. The bar was about half full, and she was working with one other coworker, and because there wasn't too much going on, they were just kind of chatting and having a little bit of fun when this man walks in the restaurant. And she said he immediately caught her eye because he was just very attractive. He was like tall, dark, and handsome, and she put him at about 35 years old, which was about 10 years older than her at the time. He was dressed in a suit and tie, and she said for a moment she was staring at him, and even her coworker looks at her and goes, "That guy's really hot." They're both kind of checking this man out when he bypasses the host stand and heads straight for the bar and sits down. He orders a glass of wine. Amber ended up serving him because she said her coworker at the time looked at her and said, "Go ahead, you need this one." I assume because her coworker knew about the breakup. But Amber ends up serving him. He tells her that this is one of his favorite wines, and she's still acting very professional, and she says, "We have a lot of great wines. Do you want to see the menu?" And he says, "No, I think I'm just going to have one, and then I'm going to go back to my hotel." And she says, "Oh, I assume you're from out of town then?" And he says, "Yeah, I'm here for work." And she says, "What do you do?" And he tells her he's in consulting. Amber doesn't think anything of it. A lot of people that come into her work have very similar conversations, but they end up talking. He's flirting with her a little bit. She's flirting back, even though she said it had been years since she flirted. He asks for the check after one glass of wine. She gives it to him. He asks her name. She tells him Amber. She asks his name, and he says his name is Jack. That's just what we're going to call him for the sake of the story. Jack ends up saying, "I'm leaving tomorrow, but I am actually in this city a lot for work. I'll be back next month. I'll come and see you." And she says, "I hope you do." His bill is $32. He leaves $150 cash on the bar and tells her to keep the change, and then says, "I'll see you later," and leaves. Amber thinks it was really nice. She thinks the man was really nice. Doesn't expect to see him again. This is just sort of the type of place that she works at. So she goes back to her normal life. About a month goes by, and in walks this man again on another night, but she's serving. It was a busy night, but she caught him kind of staring at her from his position at the bar. And eventually she just walked over to him and she was like, "Oh, you did come back." And he said, "I told you I'd be back to see you. Like, why aren't you behind the bar?" And she says, "Oh, well, I serve here too." And he says, "That's cool. Well, I'm here till tomorrow. Do you have any plans after your shift tonight? Like, do you want to go get a drink with me?" And she said, "I don't know. I have to go check on my tables, but I'll come back before you leave." And she considers it for a minute, and she's like, "I don't know if I'm ready to go out on a date or ready to go and get to know anybody else." But she tells her coworker, who's also working that night, who was there the first night, and her coworker's like, "You need to go. Like, seriously, you need to get out." And Amber said she was excited at the thought of it. So eventually she goes back over to the guy and she's like, "Yeah, I'll go get a drink with you after my shift." He goes, "Cool. What time do you get done?" She's like, "Probably like 11:30, 12." And he's like, "Okay, well, I'm gonna go back to my hotel, and where do you want to meet?" So they decided on a bar that's not too far from her restaurant, and after her shift she walks over there to meet him. At the bar having drinks, they're having a great time, they're having great conversation, and at one point Amber asks him, what does he do when it comes to consulting? And he tells her that he consults for a wide range of corporate type restaurants. Think major fast casual chains. And she's like, "Oh, that's cool, And he's like, yeah, but I'm not here to talk about myself. I want to know all about you. How long have you lived here?" And they just ended up having a really great time. So long story short, she ends up going back to his hotel. And she had driven, but she said that they ended up Ubering. But as they pull up to his hotel, which is downtown in the city where she works, he says, "We're going to have to go in separately because I'm worried that the client that I'm here consulting for is going to see me bringing a woman into my hotel room. And she thinks this is very odd because it's late. It's like 2 or 3 in the morning at this point. And she's like, why would his client just be hanging out in the lobby of the hotel, seeing who he brings back? But she doesn't question it. She doesn't know his job. And so he tells her the room number and he gets out of the Uber first. And then about 5 minutes later, she gets out and she follows him. Now, to be fair, she said that she was intoxicated this first night that she went back with him, and she doesn't remember a whole lot. Obviously, they did what they were going to do, and she wanted to, but in the morning, she left, and there were really no questions asked, and not much more getting to know each other, if you know what I mean. But he said he was flying out that day, and he's like, don't worry, I'm in the city all the time. I will, call you next month when I'm back, and they exchanged phone numbers. After he left, he did keep in touch with her. He would text her throughout the month, not every single day, but he did seem to indicate that he was very busy with work, but he would still check up on her every couple days. Like, how are you doing? How was the breakup? Because at this point she had told him what she was going through and that she still lived with her ex and was waiting to get out of the lease. Like, he knew pretty much all about her situation. She said he did genuinely seem excited to get to know her. He seemed interested in her life, and she was also excited to see him again in a few weeks. But after this all kind of happens, she's telling her coworker about it, and she mentions to her coworker that she had to go into the hotel separately. And her coworker's like, that sounds shady to me. I think he's married. And Amber's like, no, he wasn't wearing a wedding ring. And her coworker's like, obviously he wouldn't be wearing a wedding ring, but like, did you ever look him up? And she's like, no, I actually don't even know his last name. And her coworker's like, okay, you need to find out his last name before you're meeting up with this guy again. So Amber texts him as she's at work this one night, and she goes, hey, what's your last name, by the way? Like, I'm just curious. And he responds something playful, like, why, do you want to stalk me? And she was like, no, I'm just curious. Like, I realized that, we're 2 months into knowing each other and I still don't know your last name. And he gives her a very generic last name. We'll say Green. That's obviously not what he told her, but it's something very similar to that. So she tells her coworker, she's like, he said his name is Jack Green. And her coworker's like, oh my gosh, could it be more generic? She's like, well, look him up. Like, let's find him on social media. So they start doing detective work and they're looking him up on various social platforms and nothing is turning up. And so they're Googling him with like his job title or what they think his job title is, which all she knows is consultant. She also knows the city where he says he's from, but it's another major city. So they're putting John Green, consultant, Las Vegas. It's not Las Vegas, but they're Googling those things and they're getting just so many results, but none of them are for this man. So her coworker's like, yeah, he's definitely married. I'm calling it now. And Amber tried to play it off, but she said it did bother her. And at this point she was starting to wonder, was he married? But she said he was coming back in like another week. And she just thought she would ask him more about it then. She would find out then, because if he was married, she didn't want any part of it. So he comes back to town. They make plans to meet on a night after she got off work, but he ends up showing up at her work and he's like, I just couldn't wait to see you. And that really made her feel good. They repeat their whole routine. She gets off work, she goes to meet him for drinks. And this time she decides she's just going to flat out ask him. She goes, hey, by the way, are you married? And he's like, no, I'm not married. Why do you think that? And she's like, well, I was talking to my coworker about it and we just couldn't find anything about you on social media. And he was like, oh, so you were trying to stalk me? And she's like, no, I just genuinely wanted to know more about you because we've been talking more. And he's like, you can look through my phone. Like, I'm not married. He's like, it's something I want. I just travel all the time, but I promise you I'm not hiding anything. And he's like, look through my photos. And he opens up his album on his phone and he starts flipping through photos. He's like, if you see anything weird that you want to ask me about, feel free. And she said he was very convincing. She did briefly look at his phone, but ultimately it made her feel weird. And so she just gave it back and she goes, okay, I believe you. They go back to his hotel room, and this time he's staying at a different hotel, but they repeat the same thing. He goes in first, she follows about 5 minutes later, and she notices this time, because she's not so intoxicated, that when she gets in the room, the phone is unplugged. She said she only noticed because she went to plug her own phone charger in the outlet next to the bed, and so she asked him, she goes, why is the phone unplugged? And he said, oh, just privacy. I just don't really trust people, especially at hotels, listening in. And she thought it was a weird explanation, but she thinks, I don't travel as much as he does. Maybe he knows something I don't. And then she sees there's this little box, and it looks like a radio, but like an older radio, and it's sitting on the table. And she goes, what's that? And he goes, oh, it's just something I use for work. It's basically like a recording device that I can record client notes for meetings. She goes, oh, okay. And they do their thing. She falls asleep. She's staying there for the night. And at about 3 a.m, she said she woke up because she heard 2 voices, which sounded like a phone on speaker. Like she was listening to someone's conversation. And she's very confused, and she pops up in bed. He's still sleeping, and she sees that the TV is off. The phone is obviously unplugged. She thinks for a second that maybe it's 2 people having a conversation out in the hallway, like outside of her door, but she realizes that it's coming from the other side of the room, closer to the window. So she's listening, and she realizes that the voices are coming from this little box. Said it was static, but it was definitely 2 different male voices speaking, and they were saying things that almost sounded military in nature, like no deviation detected and continue passive monitoring. So she's very confused. She wakes him up and she goes, hey, what is that voice coming from that box over there? He's half asleep, but he rolls over and he listens for a second. He says, oh, it's just the signal people. Don't worry, they're mostly harmless. Just go back to bed. He's immediately pretty much snoring again. So she shakes him a little bit harder and she goes, hey, wake up. Who are the signal people? And as soon as she says these words, his eyes pop open. He goes, what'd you say? He goes, you just told me that the voices I'm hearing coming from that box over there are the signal people. Who are the signal people? He sits straight up in bed and he said, what did you hear them say? And he has this look of fear on his face that she said actually scared her too. I need to know exactly what they said. And she said, I don't know, something about continued passive monitoring. And he says, you need to leave immediately. And he gets up and he pulls his pants on. He's like, I'll walk you out right now. In the lobby, she calls an Uber and he's pacing around. He's looking over his shoulder. Car pulls up and she goes, who are the signal people? And he said, just people that monitor things. So after Amber gets in her Uber, she's very shaken up by his reaction to her asking about the signal people. He gets home, but ultimately texts him before she falls asleep and just says, tonight made me feel very strange. I would love a better explanation of what you were freaking out about and why you were looking over your shoulder in the lobby while I was waiting for my Uber. She knew that he was leaving town that morning, as he usually did, the day after they would meet up, but she said that he had never left her on read before and was always very responsive to her texts. So she expected a response by the time she woke up. But when she woke up, she had nothing. She had to work that day, so she got ready and still hadn't heard from him, but she thought maybe he was flying and she tried not to get too in her head about it. But by the time she got off work that night, she still hadn't heard anything and she decided to text him again because she was really bummed that he had just ghosted at this point. So she texts him and she says, did I do something wrong? Did I ask too many questions? I would love to talk to you again. If you don't want to explain everything, that's fine. I just want to feel comfortable when I'm with you. And almost immediately after sending the text, she received a text back from him. The text was very strange. It almost seemed to be a robotic type response. And it said, monitoring acknowledged, continue normal activity. She sends him back a question mark, does not receive a response. So she tells her coworker about all of this. And her coworker is like, I'm pretty sure he's married and that his wife tapped his phone. And that's why you're getting these voices, because he probably has a PI, because again, her coworker is still spiraling about this. Amber said that she rejects this idea because that didn't line up with the signal people that she heard coming from this radio that was in his room. She said that that also didn't explain what happened 2 days later. She said she did try calling him the following day, but his phone was either off or disconnected, but she didn't even get a voicemail. Phone would say call failed or call ended before she even hung up. And she said, I've never been blocked by a person before, so I'm not sure if this is what happened, but either way, I couldn't get through to him even if I wanted to. She's obviously feeling pretty down in the dumps about it because she did really like him and enjoyed her time getting to know him, even though the last night with him was very strange. So on a day off, she decides she's going to treat herself to lunch. She goes out by herself to a fast casual restaurant chain, one of her favorite comfort meals. And she goes to the counter and she's ordering and she notices that two men walk in behind her and they're talking quietly to themselves behind her in line. But she noticed that they were wearing dark suits, dark sunglasses, and they just seemed like out of the ordinary. I thought maybe, though, because they were in a business district, that they were just two guys on lunch who dressed a little bit too formal for the everyday business attire. Anyway, she orders her food. She goes and sits at a table and is waiting for her order to be called. And she notices the two men place their order and they sit at the table directly next to her, even though there's multiple other tables open in the restaurant. Name and order is called. She goes up to get it from the counter and she ends up sitting at a different table. And then those guys' names and orders are called and they get up and they get their food and then they sit next to her again. And so finally they're looking at her as she's eating and she just looks at them and she says, can I help you with something? One of the guys raises his sunglasses and she said that the only thing she really noticed about him or remembers about him is that he had this piercing green eyes. And he said, were you with Jack Green yesterday? Just caught her off guard and she goes, no, I wasn't with him yesterday, but I saw him 2 days ago. The other guy pulls out a little notepad and a pen from his little pocket and he writes down, he said, you said 2 days ago? And the first guy says, did he happen to say anything about a signal or a monitoring group? And she looks at him strangely and she says, yeah, actually. Do you work with him or something? Like, what do you know about the signal people? Because he acted really, really strange when I brought it up. But the guy with the green eyes completely ignores her question. He said, how do you know about the signal group? And she said, I don't. I heard somebody talking on his radio and he described those people as the signal people. And a second guy says, you weren't supposed to hear that. First guy said, tell me what you heard exactly. And she said, when he said that, she had this awful pit in her stomach. Like she just felt like she was part of something that she was not supposed to hear or be part of at all. So at this point, she just decided that she was going to go. And she was like, honestly, I didn't really hear anything. I'm really uncomfortable, so I'm going to leave. And she stands up and she starts packing her food up to go. And the two guys both stand up. And she said it felt very intimidating. Like it was the middle of the day. There were other people around. But she said she's never had that gut feeling of like, I need to get away from these people right now. The guy with the green eye says, I need to know exactly what you heard. She's looking around. She's like, are the workers going to do something? But nothing seems out of the ordinary to the outside observer, right? Like, it's just three people standing up by some tables. And she says, I told you I didn't really hear anything, just something about like passive monitoring. The second guy touches her arm and he says, did you repeat those words to anybody else? And she says, no. He says, are you sure? And she says, yes. And he says, okay, thank you for your time. You can leave. She said it was so strange. She got out of there, got in her car, was looking over her shoulder the entire time, didn't see anyone following her, and headed home. Weeks passed, no contact with Jack. Even though she tried calling, it would be the same thing. The call failed or the call ended before she even got to a voicemail. And she just thinks that he's blocked her and ghosted her at this point. Still unsettled by these people that she encountered at the fast casual restaurant chain where she was eating lunch, but hadn't seen them again, so wasn't too worried about it. And then she said she started getting a bunch of robocalls, and this may have been coincidence, but she started getting calls from unknown numbers or from numbers she didn't recognize. She would answer, hear a click, and then the phone would disconnect. She said on one occasion, about a year after this incident, she did receive a text, and it was from Jack's number, and all it said was signal received. She tried to call him, and the phone did the same thing. Call failed. The frequency of these like robocalls just increased, and she said she ultimately ended up changing her number. She wanted to do it after the breakup anyway, so it wasn't the end of the world. And when she changed her number, all of those phone calls stopped. Only one other thing that happened that she says may be related, but about 2 years after she received the last text from Jack, she received an email, and it was like a generic number letter combination. Sender's name was nonsensical, and all the message said was subject remains unaware. It was very strange and initially deleted it, but then decided that she was going to respond to it. But when she responded to it, it bounced back and said mail delivery failure or something along those lines. She acknowledges that that may have been a coincidence too, because she said Jack never actually had her email. But she says at the end of this, she's no longer scared anymore. Enough years have passed where she feels like it's safe to tell this story. She still doesn't know who Jack really was. She doesn't know who he worked for. She doesn't know who the men were that followed her that day. She said she can't help thinking of the signal people from time to time and wonders who they really were or what they were listening for. Let me know your thoughts and theories. I'm very curious and excited about the comments on this one because I don't have any words or any thoughts about what I think could have been going on. Maybe government, but that might be just my conspiratorial brain going crazy. Let me know what you think. If you have a spooky, scary story time that you think nobody would believe, something that really happened to you that still unsettles you, whether it has a real conclusion or not, we would love to hear it. We love theorizing over here. Spooky Scary Storytime submission is called The Voodoo Man, and it came from Dawn. She said it's actually her mother Debbie's story, but it's shared with permission. These are their real names. And she said this took place when her mother Debbie was a teenager in the 1970s. Mother was 15 years old, living in Bladenboro, North Carolina, or Hogwaller as the locals call it, and life there was slow and predictable. Nothing much exciting ever happened until it did. And one day Debbie realizes that one of her older neighbors has been following her, and she starts to see him all over town when she's out with her friends, when she's on dates, when she's leaving school, when she's arriving to school. And he even starts driving past their house, and as he passes their house, he slows down and he cranes his neck like he's trying to see if she sees him. He even starts calling the house, and when she answers, he hangs up, but she knows that it's this man. You would see him in places where he had no business, in the parking lot or walking across the street as she was crossing. And finally, it just really bothered her enough that she told her mother's boyfriend, whose name was Bobby Johnson. Much was shared about Bobby Johnson, but Debbie liked Bobby, and he was really protective of her. He was like a father figure, and she just had a really good relationship with him. So when she tells him that this man's been following her all over town, he just says, I'm going to handle it. She goes, what are you going to do? And he goes, come with me tonight. So that night, they get in his red sports car, and they start driving out of town, and the pavement turns into dirt roads, and they're just driving on this long stretch of road where Debbie has never been before. She doesn't really remember where they went, but she knows it was out in the country, and she remembers looking up at the moon and seeing that it was full that night. And finally, after it seems like they've been driving forever, they pull up to this house that looks completely dark, completely abandoned. He goes, where are we going? And Bobby just says, follow me. And they walk up to this house, and she says she remembers the paint was peeling off the house and the porch was sagging in, and she just had a really bad feeling. But Bobby knocks on the door, and this enormous man answers. He's almost 7 foot tall. He's kind of hunched over. He's wearing a dirty white t-shirt and overalls. Bobby says this man absolutely terrified her. She had never seen anybody that looked like him before. But he motions them in, and Bobby follows, and she follows Bobby, and they walk into this man's house, and she said the air was just thick with dust, and they walk into this man's kitchen, and she saw that there were bones hanging from the ceiling and chicken feet. She just stops, and she's looking around, and Bobby and this man sit down at this man's table, and they're talking quietly to themselves, and she can't really make out what's being said, but she hears the neighbor's name, the guy that's been following her. And she's just kind of like afraid to move because she's terrified to be there. But finally, the tall man stands up from the table and comes over to her. And she said he made eye contact. And that's when she noticed that his eyes were completely red. Not bloodshot, not like angry, just completely red. The pupils, the iris, like the whites of his eyes were red, everything. And he's staring at her. And then after a moment, he stretches out his hand and he puts this little blue wrapped box in her hand. Holds out a small square of blue cloth that's wrapped tightly with a string, and he says, "Never open this, never lose this." He said she didn't ask any questions. She was actually too afraid to, so she just wrapped her hand around it and put it in her pocket. And she said she never did open it, but she kept it on her. And after they left, she asked Bobby in the car, like, who was that man? Like, what was that all about? And he just said, "Don't worry, your problem's been handled," and didn't say another word to her the entire ride home. So she gets home, life continues as normal. She still sees this man stalking her, but weeks later, out of nowhere, this man apparently dies in a car crash. Unexpected, horrible accident, but apparently the phone stopped ringing. She never feared for her safety again when she was out with friends or going to school. She said even though her fear eased slowly, she never forgot that night, and she would later find out that that man who lived in that seemingly abandoned house was known around town as the Voodoo Man. Anyone that knew him didn't call him that jokingly. They said it as a warning, and she ended up finding out that he never even actually took payment for anything that he did for people. He was told that if he helped you, the cost was never about money. And she said she still never opened that box. She never even told anyone about it. She said, strangely enough, she doesn't even actually know where it is now. She knows she didn't throw it away. She remembers packing it up for a move, but then was never able to find it again. To this day, Debbie believes that some problems don't just go away, they don't just fade, and they have to be removed. Debbie says even all these years later, after 50 years, she still feels like something is watching out for her. Hell is thin, y'all, because we got another story from someone who claims to have met someone who may not have been human at all. This story comes from someone named Bridget. That's a pseudonym, but she said she's a scientist who's written over 300 papers. And despite this, she still had her fair share of woo-woo stuff happen, but nothing ever like this. So this took place at the Atlanta airport on February 11th, 2026, so very recently. And she was flying through Atlanta to go to Las Vegas because she was going to see the Wizard of Oz at the Sphere. And she said she's not from Atlanta, but she has been to that airport many times. She's flown over 1.5 million miles and knows that airport like the back of her hand because it just seems like she's always flying through Atlanta. She's coming up the escalator on her way to Concourse B. She had to go to gate B18, and she gets off the escalator and she looks to her right and she sees what she described as a gorgeous light-skinned African-American woman with coiled gray hair on top of her head. She was very tall, she was very elegant, but she was walking very, very slowly. And this woman really seems to be struggling to walk. And Bridget says that she also struggles with a tick-borne illness, so she knows what it's like to get tired walking. And so she approaches this woman and she says, "Can I help you get somewhere?" And this woman looks at her and says, "Oh, honey, I must look as bad as I feel." Bridget says, "Oh, no, I didn't mean it like that." She said this woman was gorgeous. She looked maybe European, but she doesn't recall an accent. And they were right outside of B10 and she was going to B18. So she still had a little bit of time. And she's like, "Well, I'll just walk with you. I'll help you. Do you want to take my elbow?" And the woman just taps her on the inside of the arm and she says, "No, honey, I'm fine." It was a Wednesday at about 6:30 p.m. The airport was typically packed with business travel, but she noticed that nobody was touching them as they walked by. And Bridget says that she's been in a wheelchair because of her illness before, and she thought that that was strange because people just tend to push when they get in a hurry. But everybody was kind of making way, and they were walking so slow they were almost shuffling. But after about 10 minutes, the woman looks at her and says, "You know what, honey, I think I could use an orange juice." Coming up to a Starbucks anyway, so Bridget guides her to a seat and says, "You sit here, I'll go get you an orange juice from the coffee shop and I'll be right back." And she said she could still see the woman from where she was standing in the coffee shop after she entered. And she says, "Can I get an orange juice?" And they say, "We only have orange mango." And she goes, "I'm not sure if she's going to like that. Let me bring it to her and then I'll be right back." Barista kind of gives her a look and she says, "I'm just bringing it to that gorgeous woman sitting right there." And the barista says, "What woman?" And she turns and she looks and she can't see the woman anymore, but she's like, she must just be behind that column. It was no more than 4 long strides from the entrance of the coffee shop to where this woman was sitting. So she goes back over there, doesn't see the woman, and she's looking around this pedestrian-filled concourse and cannot see her anywhere. And she said, "This woman was very tall. I'm very tall." She was also stood out like a sore thumb because of how she was dressed. So I don't know where she could have gone in that time because I wasn't gone for more than 2 minutes, and she also walked very, very slowly. So she's confused. She looks at the woman who's sitting at the next chair over and she says, "Excuse me, did you see where this woman that was sitting here just went?" The woman looks at her strangely and says, "What woman?" And she says, "She's dressed like a movie star. She was just sitting right here." And the woman said, "I'm sorry, I wasn't paying any attention." So then she looks at the man who's sitting on the other side of this chair and she says, "Excuse me, did you see where the woman who was just sitting here got up to go?" And he looks at her very strangely and he says, "There was nobody sitting there." She said at this point she genuinely believed that both of those people were just in their own worlds and not paying attention, and she did not believe that this woman just disappeared into thin air. So she says, "Okay, never mind, thank you." And she goes back to the coffee shop and she brings it back, and the barista's like, "What happened? Didn't she like it?" She said when he asked that question, she just had this pit in her stomach and she felt so bad that she lost this woman who she felt really needed her help. She was so bothered and concerned about this that she actually ended up going up to the gate agent. And she said that she knows that gate agents at airports are keenly aware of everyone around them for multiple reasons. And the gate agent's this tall man, and she says, "Excuse me, did you see this woman who was sitting right here? She's a very striking woman. She's dressed like a movie star." We walked up to the gate together, and we were walking so slowly that we were basically shuffling. And the gate agent just says, "No, I'm sorry, but I'll help you keep an eye out for her." And she says, "Yeah, I just feel like I'm going crazy. I feel like I just was talking to a ghost." She really did not mean anything by it. She was just kind of thinking out loud, and it was the first analogy that she could come up with. But the gay agent peers over his glasses and he says, "You know, baby, that would be a real possibility for you." He said it was so odd. So she just looked at him and said, "What?" And he said, "You know that, right?" She said it just struck her as so strange, but there was nothing else she could do. The woman was gone. So eventually she just waited out her flight and eventually got in line to board. And that same gay agent ended up being the gay agent who scanned her ticket. He tells him thank you and says, "You know, by the way, I never found that glamorous woman I was telling you about earlier." And he looks at her and he has no sense of recognition in his eyes. And he says, "What woman? Who are you talking about?" He says, "You know, I came up to you and I was asking you to help me keep an eye out for that woman that I was looking for." And he says, "I didn't help you, but thank you for flying X, Y, and Z airline. Have a safe flight." Because the entire experience was so strange, she still can't stop thinking about it. She has never had anything like that happen previously, but she can't help but feeling like she was part of another dimension for a moment, and maybe that gate agent was also part of that dimension, however brief. This experience was followed by another odd physical experience a few weeks later, but did not go into detail. However, she said that she feels like her awareness about the hidden worlds around her are expanding. Who do you think this woman was? Clearly, no one else around her saw this woman. If you have a spooky, scary story time that you think nobody would believe, send it in. We would love to hear it. We believe you. Brooke sent me a message and she said, "I either saw something I wasn't supposed to see or experienced a glitch in the matrix moment. I'm not sure. I've never been able to make sense of this." And after reading her message, I'm curious too. So I'm thinking maybe there's a police officer or a sheriff out there who may be able to weigh in and explain what was going on here. But Brooke said this happened in Lakeside City, which is a small town in Texas. And at the time she was making deliveries on a food delivery app for extra money. And on this particular day, she had her husband and her 2-year-old daughter with her. Their final delivery for the day. She said she pulled into a gas station, filled up the pump, and as she was sitting there waiting for the gas tank to fill up, she was on her phone transferring funds from one account to another. And all of a sudden, her husband looks at her and he's got this horrible look on his face and he goes, "Look right there." And he motions to the pump right next to them, and they see on the ground, laying on the cement, is this lifeless man. And she goes, "Oh my gosh, what happened?" Because that man was not there when they pulled in a few minutes earlier. There's no other cars at the pumps, nothing going on. And basically, as soon as they see this man, this sheriff jumps up in their window and he goes, "What are you guys doing here? Put your hands up." Their hands raised. She said that they told him that they were just delivering for an app and getting gas, and she was just sitting in her car transferring funds, but that they had no idea what was going on. And also she said they looked around and they didn't see any police cars or anything to indicate that there was a police presence in the area, but this man was wearing sheriff attire from head to toe. "Well, you guys need to get out of here right now." And she says, obviously they listened to him. They were freaked out. So they pulled out of the pump and they were driving around and they were trying to figure out what happened. They're like, maybe it was a robbery gone wrong. So she said after a little while they drove by, but they didn't see any type of police presence in the area. The man was gone. The sheriff was gone. Nothing to indicate that anything had happened, and not that much time had passed. So they go home, and she said the next morning she was still curious. So she gets online and she starts looking up if there's any robberies in the area, who's on crime, anything that would explain what she and her husband saw the day before. But she said she couldn't find anything. She even checked social media pages. Couldn't find a thing. But her husband's curious about it too, and he actually had a friend that was a sheriff on the local sheriff's department. So he's like, "I'm gonna call my friend and see if he'll tell me what was going on." So he calls his friend, explains what happened, and his friend's like, "Nothing like that happened in the area. I would know about it." She's like, "We're being gaslit." So she calls the gas station and she's like, "Hey, I was there, yesterday. I just wanted to make sure everything was okay. I saw the man in the parking lot who was lifeless." And the person who worked at the gas station was like, "That didn't happen yesterday." She was like, "I was here all day yesterday. I didn't see anything like that. I don't know what you're talking about. Are you sure you have the right gas station?" And Brooke said she felt completely gaslit, still has no idea what happened. She has Googled many times to no avail. That it's a small enough town that she thought that eventually if she asked around enough, somebody would know what happened, but nobody has any idea of this happening in that town. So she says, "Am I crazy for thinking it's a glitch in the matrix, or what do your followers think?" Message from someone named Michelle who said she's been holding on to this story for almost 30 years and she still has no explanation for it, but she said it's 100% true, it's very spooky, and there's actually other people that will vouch for her that this actually happened. Said almost 30 years ago when she was 25 years old, she was hired to run this bar and restaurant, and she was basically hired to bring this bar back to life because it was not very busy, struggling to get customers, and she was working very, very hard to revive it. And this was in Kentucky. It was called T-Bones. I don't know if it's still there, and I don't know what part of Kentucky it's actually in or was in. But anyway, she said that there was basically split into two parts. One side was a higher end steakhouse that was open during the day for lunch, and then they were open for dinner service as well. And then the other side was a bar section that opened at 4 p.m. Michelle obviously was working a lot of long days as the general manager of this restaurant. And she said one day, about 2 hours before open, she was sitting in the office. She had the door partially open and she was placing a wine order when all of a sudden there was a head that popped into her partially opened office door. Didn't recognize this person. It was a man. She said he looked like old paintings of Jesus. I don't know how else to describe it. But she said he also had this very calming presence about him. But he pops his head in and he says, "I'm here about the assistant job. Your employees told me that I could find you back here." Before, Michelle had actually decided that she was going to hire basically an assistant position, somebody to run errands, to go to the local farmers markets for local produce and to the local butcher shops for local meat. But she said she hadn't actually posted that job anywhere yet. But she figured that one of the other employees must have known this man and told him about the job. She's like, perfect, this must be a referral. Now I don't even need to find somebody. Come on in right now. I will interview you on the spot. And she starts telling him about the job and he's like, this all sounds great, except for I don't have a car. And she goes, that's really not a big deal because it's for the company. You can use my car. Really weren't any other issues. She said he seemed perfect for the job. He was very well spoken. She put him at about 45 years old. Even though he didn't tell her who referred him to the job and said that he didn't have any experience doing anything like this before, she was like, it's just basically a personal assistant. Like, how hard could it be? But she tells him, like, basically, let's try it out. You can work for a couple days and see if you like it. And if it goes well, then we'll fill out your paperwork. Because he also said that he wanted to be paid in cash. And also, before you come for her, I've worked at dive bars before, especially in my early 20s, and a lot of these places did pay under the table back then. I got like $15 a shift, so it's not that unlikely, especially years ago. She said life got busy. She never actually ended up filling out the paperwork. She was paying him cash anyway, and it just was what it was. She said that he was actually one of the best employees that she had. He was always on time at work, and he always walked to work, but on colder days or when it was raining out, she would actually offer to pick him up sometimes because he was on her route. She had been to his house. She met his sister who he lived with. So they lived in a very nice house. Everything's all fine and great. But about 6 months after this man started working there, he doesn't show up for work one day. She's like, that's really unlike him. Calls the house because keep in mind, this is 30 years ago. People didn't have cell phones back then. And it just goes to the answering machine. Next day, he doesn't show up for work again. She tries calling the house again. Again, no answer. Finally, after a few days, his sister calls her back from the house phone. And she goes, I'm so sorry. I was out of town. Like, what's going on? And she goes, we haven't seen your brother in a few days. He hasn't showed up for work. It's just very unlike him. We're worried. And she goes, oh, well, I saw him this morning out back. Let me talk to him. I'll figure out why he hasn't been going to work and I'll have him call you. He doesn't end up calling her that day. But that night she goes to bed. She's laying in bed. She's about to fall asleep. And she said she was laying on her side of the bed. And from where she laid, she could see down the long hallway past her daughter's room where she kept a nightlight. And right before she falls asleep, she has a sensation of being watched. So she pops open her eyes and she sees Kevin on his hands and knees at the end of the long hallway. And she said his normally well-kept hair was like brushed down, touching the floor. And his head was like crooked in this unnatural way, the way that you would expect something out of a zombie movie. She sits up, she screams his name, and then her husband wakes up. She looks at her husband to be like, this man's in our house, and then she looks back and he's gone. Her husband's obviously like, you had a really bad dream, that wasn't real. And she was like, I was terrified because I felt like it was 100% real. I could not sleep that night at all, so I just stayed up. The next morning she waited, she called his sister, and his sister answers, and she's crying, and she tells her that they found Kevin the night before. He had passed by his own hand in the garage. Sister tells her that she had been getting ready to call her when the phone rang, and it's just been a really rough morning. And she goes, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. He was a great employee. I will do whatever I can to help you. And his sister's like, okay, thank you. And so in trying to help his sister with the arrangements, they needed his social security number because his sister didn't have it. I was like, oh, no worries. We have his employment record on file. I'll just pull it from there. Well, she looks and she realizes they never filled out the paperwork. And then she asks the sister, like, you didn't find his ID in his wallet or anything? Like, you can't pull it? And she goes, no, I opened his wallet after he passed and all I found was cash. I was like, well, can you go to the DMV or can you go to public records? And she's like, I've done all of that and there's no record of his existence. Michelle's like, look, I want to help, but this all seems really weird. Are your parents still around? And she's like, no, our parents passed. I've actually only known about him for about a year or so. I didn't even know I had a brother. And then Michelle said that she found out that the way that the sister found out about him was very similar to the way that she met him. He just apparently popped up in the sister's life and was like, I'm your long lost brother. And they loved each other as siblings pretty much immediately because he had all this evidence that he was in fact her brother. That was weird. The sister was grieving. They had him cremated and they were going to have, his arrangements. So then she's telling all of her employees, unfortunately, Kevin has passed. And she's asking the employees, like, actually, who's the one that referred him to me? And none of the employees knew him previously. All said that they really enjoyed working with him and that he had a calming presence on them, but none of them had known him. And she still doesn't understand how he even knew about the assistant job because, like I said, it wasn't posted. So she said all these years later, she is still wondering who he was. The name that was given to her was Kevin Schmutz. She said it still bothers her that she knew someone without ever knowing who they truly were. I got a story from someone named Tiana who said she saw a werewolf. And I'll be honest with you, when I started Spooky Scary Storytime, I wasn't too keen on the idea of cryptids existing, right? I liked Glitch in the Matrix stories. I liked unexplained events. I liked even vampire stories. But cryptids were always something that I didn't know a whole lot about. But after reading all of these emails and all of these sightings from people, who am I to say that it's not out there? I don't know enough to say one way or the other. However, I will say that the amount of people who are claiming to have seen these things is astounding. Actually, I just had the idea. If I can figure out how to make a map and pinpoint these sightings where these stories come from, I'm going to try to figure out how to do that. But I'm going to tell you Tiana's story. This took place near Berwick, Maine, not too far from the Salmon Falls River. And it was really late. She had been at her cousin's house, and she said her cousin has a really nice house with a long driveway, but it's surrounded by woods. And so it was about 2 a.m, just her and her toddler driving home. And she said it was the end of summer. The windows were rolled down. It was a really, really nice night. She was likely speeding a little bit, but there was nobody else out. The stretch of road that she was on was very rural, completely surrounded by woods, 2-lane road. And she had never felt creeped out driving out there before. But as she's driving, she sees an animal's eyes reflect off her headlights about 200 feet in front of her. So she slams on the brakes. She said so hard that her tires squealed and she comes to a screeching halt. She sat there with her foot still on the brake. She could not believe what she was seeing because she said at first she almost thought that it was a person wearing a wolf costume. It was on all fours standing in front of her car, and she said it was shaking its head back and forth, kind of rubbing its nose with its paw the way a dog would if it got stung by a bee. Assumed it was injured, and she said what made her think that it was a person wearing a wolf costume was just the way that it looked. It had long shaggy hair, but its limbs were too long to be that of a wolf or any kind of dog she had ever seen. Thought somebody's out there playing a prank on her or something. She's still trying to figure out what's going on when this thing turns its head to look at her, and she said its eyes glowed yellow like an amber orange, and then it stands up on 2 legs, and it's way taller than any person could possibly be. Said she had definitely ruled out at this point that it was a costume. It looked like a wolf. It had the snout and everything, and she said her son was asleep in the back seat, and she was completely dumbfounded, completely afraid at this point. And almost as quickly as it made eye contact with her, it dropped back down to all fours and took off running on all fours past the tree line into the woods. And she said she took off speeding. She was not about to stick around and try to figure out what was going on out there. But she said that she still thinks about it. This happened in 2009, and she lives in Ohio now. But anytime she goes back to visit family, she drives through that area with her windows up, and she gets out of there as fast as she can because she said she believes that something is out in those woods. Giselle wrote into Spooky Scary Storytime, and she was like, I had a really creepy experience with what I think was a creature, or at least a non-human entity, at a Walmart in Deltona, Florida. It gets really weird. So she said it was like 2 p.m. on a weekday, and she likes going to that Walmart neighborhood market because it's in a shopping plaza where she gets food, she gets her pedicures, and then she goes to Walmart and she does all her grocery shopping. So she does her normal errands, then she goes to Walmart and she starts in the produce section. Taking her time, she's making a little day of it. She picks up bananas, garlic, spinach, and then she makes her way over to grab some onions. And after she grabs the onions, she turns toward the apples, and she notices that there's this man staring at a green apple, and he's very tall, he's very heavy set, and he has absolutely no hair. And that's not that weird in itself. Some people have alopecia. Never tell a story just because someone looked weird, right? But she said he had no hair, no eyebrows, no body hair. His skin was as smooth as a baby's. He was also overwhelmingly pale. Or all black clothing, which stood in stark contrast to his skin. And he's standing there holding a green apple. I got an apple. I have a prop for this video, and he's holding it like this, and he's examining it in the light, and he's turning it back and forth. And then she notices his left eye, because it's about 3 times the size of his right eye. It's completely black, and it seems to be protruding out of his face. And so she's standing there like, I've never seen a man that looks like this in my life. And she's looking around to see if anyone's staring at him, and she notices nobody's paying him any attention. She's standing there for a couple minutes, and he's still just examining this apple, just turning it back and forth, looking at it up and down, trying to figure out what's going on with it. And finally she gets curious, and she walks over to him. Thought he maybe just had some medical issues, but she was genuinely curious what his fascination was with this apple. So she walks over to him, and she says something like, haha, I always thoroughly examine my produce too. And he looks at her for a second, then he looks around and he goes, are you talking to me? And she goes, yeah. And he gets like giddy, and he's smiling ear to ear, and she said his features seemed too large for his face, but she thought that maybe that was just because he was a very large man. Says as she started speaking to him, she noticed that his left eye, the one that was protruding from his face, had this like inky depth to it that sort of swirled around, and it made her feel comfortable. It made her feel like he was harmless. And he says, what are you here shopping for? He says, oh, just my normal groceries. What are you here for? And he said, nothing really. I'm just here looking around. And she thought that was kind of weird, but she's like, how much weirder could this interaction get? And she goes, well, I've pretty much gotten everything I need from this section, so I'm going to go have a good day. And he goes, can I walk with you? He said nothing about this man made her feel threatened whatsoever. It was the middle of the day. There's a ton of other people around. She's like, sure. So she starts walking through the store. He starts eating his apple, and he starts asking her all kinds of questions. He says, how much fruit do you eat? And then he says, this apple is delicious. And she says, yeah, apples are really good. And he says, do you like the sun? Do you go out in the sun a lot? He goes, yeah, I guess so. We live in Florida. And he said, interesting. Do all Walmarts have the same layout? And she goes, I don't know. He asks how old she is, and she says, I'm 22, which is how old she was at the time. And she thought really at this point that he just wanted somebody to talk to, that maybe he was just lonely. And she goes, how old are you? Just to be polite, you know? And he says, you wouldn't believe me if I told you. Struck her as odd because he didn't look that old to her, but then he says, where have I seen you before? And she goes, we've never met before. And she's like thinking, you know, like, trust me, I would remember. He goes, are you sure? No, we've met before. And that started to creep her out. They're still walking aisle to aisle. She's grabbing things she needs, and he's still asking her a ton of odd questions. And she starts to notice that everyone around her is staring, like they're stopping and staring. And she goes, this is so rude. Like, who stares at someone that they don't know like this? Starts to feel oddly protective of him, and they're still just talking back and forth. And finally they get to like a cooler section, and she's grabbing some frozen things she needs, and she notices this family, and they all stop and they're just looking at her. Then she became aware that people were staring at her, not the man. So she's like, is there something on my face? So she leans in the cooler door to see if there's something on her face. And when she backs up, she realizes that there's no reflection of whoever she's talking to. She turns around and the man is still standing to her left. She looks back in the reflection of the cooler and only sees her own reflection. She turns back to the man and he's smiling and he says, what's wrong? Said she actually blinked her eyes a few times to make sure that she wasn't just like imagining things. But the man standing there, solid as can be, leaned up against the cooler door, and she's like, I have to get out of here. So she's like, I think I've got everything I need. Like, I'm gonna head to checkout. And he's like, cool, I'll walk with you. So she's walking to checkout, and as she reaches the checkout line, she's like, okay, well, I'm gonna get out of here. I hope you have a good day. Do you have any plans? And he says, can I get your phone number? She says, no, I'm sorry, I don't give my number out to strangers. And she's still aware that there's people standing around her watching her. He just says, okay, and he watches her go to the checkout line and start putting her things on the belt. And she's going through checkout, and she's still kind of keeping an eye on him, and he's standing at the front of the checkout line. But she said she wanted to see if he would walk out of Walmart, but he didn't. He just stood there watching her as she checked out. So she goes to pay, and when she looks back after paying, he's gone. Walks out of the Walmart, quickly walks to her car. She's kind of keeping an eye behind her the whole time to make sure that he's not following her. She gets in her car and she locks the doors, and she realizes that 3 hours have passed. And she's like, I only got like 8 items. So how could that much time have passed? I couldn't have been in there for more than 45 minutes. Said she experienced a range of emotions, but she ultimately decided that she had nothing to do and she was curious about this man. So she drives her car a little bit closer to the entrance and she's watching the door. She parks her car. She's eating her bag of veggie straw. She said she sat there for an hour waiting for him to walk out because she was just curious. She wanted to see where he went, but he never came out. So eventually she's like, I'm going to go back in and see if I can find him. So she walks in, she makes her way through the aisles, but she can't find him again. That she felt very confused and conflicted. She wanted answers more than anything, like who was he, where did he go? But eventually she came back out and she realized the sun was setting and she had an awful feeling in her stomach. So she just drove home and stayed in for the rest of the night. That happened in 2017, but to this day, she still thinks about it because she can't find any answers. She's like, I wonder if it looked like I was walking around Walmart talking to myself, because why wouldn't he have had a reflection? What was up with his eye? Why did I feel some sort of comfort when I looked into it? And why did he say that he knew me from somewhere? She said that's her normal Walmart. She has been there multiple times since 2017 when this happened, and she's never seen that man again. That was her real name. I'm not sure if she's going to be in the comments or not. Let her know your thoughts. As always, thank you guys so much for listening. I appreciate you more than you know. If you'd like to support the channel in another way, you can do that on patreon.com for as little as $3 or $5 a month, depending on where you're at. You can become a patron. Thank you so much to the patrons who already support the channel financially. You guys help me bring you more stories, and I'm trying to increase the output of videos that I'm posting. So now I'm doing at least one a week at least, which is awesome. Thank you guys so much. If you can't support the channel financially, no worries at all. I know it's tough out there right now. Just you guys listening, liking, hyping the video helps me out more than you know. If you want to help in another way, obviously feel free to share this podcast or this video with someone you know who also loves spooky things. I've got a lot of unread emails. I've got a lot of great stories to bring you guys. So stay spooky out there, stay curious, question everything. Until next time.